Hello and welcome to an especially sweet episode, we hope, of Something That Rhymes with Purple. This is a podcast all about words and language, and today we are indulging our sweet tooths, if you can say that. Our sweet teeth, Gyles. Do you have any?
Do I have sweet
teeth?
teeth?
Teeth, but do you have a sweet teeth?
No, I haven't. But it's funny you should say that, because people of my parents' generation often didn't have teeth. You know, people used to have false teeth. A lot of people had false teeth. And you'd go to visit old people and you'd find there was a sort of glass on the bedside, and rather sinister, floating around in the glass, were false teeth. And when I was a little boy, you could go to the sweet shop and you could get false teeth made of sweets. Did you know that?
Oh, good grief. I remember cigarettes. Do you remember those candy cigarettes that you could buy as well?
I do, and they were the only cigarettes I've ever smoked.
We thought we were very cool, didn't we? But we had a fantastic store, sadly now languished, called Woolies or Woolworths. And Woolworths had the biggest sweet section in most high streets. And it was a joy for me, Gyles, to go to Woolworths whenever I did. It wasn't often enough because we did have a local sweet shop, which was brilliant. But do you remember Woolies? Did you used to go and visit their aisles?
Woolies was one of the world's most famous stores. And there were Woolworths all over the country and indeed all over the world. But F.W. Woolworth was American, and it was global. It was huge, and it failed ultimately because it ceased to be what we always thought it was. When I was a child, you could go in and things were inexpensive there. They were laid out on different counters. You could go to Woolies and you knew what you were going to get. And then as the years went by, it sort of lost its way and we weren't quite sure what it was doing. And eventually, it's extraordinary. It was so huge and then it disappeared. But I remember those sweet counters vividly.
The pick and mix aisle.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes.
Where do we begin with the world of... Well, actually, could we begin, since we're supposed to be here talking about words and language, that's what Something Rhymes with Purple is all about, can we begin with the words sweet, which, actually, we're global. I'm calling it a sweet, but I think Americans call it candy, don't they?
They do.
Explain all that to us.
They do. So, well, the earliest records of what we refer to as sweets go back to ancient times. I mean, we're talking ancient Egyptians who would combine fruit and nuts with honey. So not quite the boiled or chewy sweets that we think of today, of course. And the noun was really first applied to a sweet food or drink, or indeed a sweet dish like a pudding or a tart or cooked fruit and that kind of thing. And they were often called sweet meats if they were in lozenge or drop form. If you think of lemon drops, I love that word. It reminds me of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. Anyway, they were called sweet meats. And in 1851, Henry Mayhew, who was a really important chronicler of the slang of the London working classes, essentially. He noted, we should do a whole episode on him because he was an amazing.
Did he write a book called London Life and the London Poor? I think
he did. He did.
Yeah.
And he speaks of something called rose acid, which he calls a transparent sweet. So I think he's talking about a boiled sweet then. So we're talking 1850s for some of our earliest records of what we today, and, you know, indeed we're talking about when we get to the pick and mix counter here. Candy is actually from Middle English when it was called sugar candy, but ultimately it goes back to a Sanskrit word, kanda, meaning a fragment, because these were little drops of sweet things or candied things indeed as well. So Sanskrit and Arabic have had quite a big influence when it comes to language, at least, on our sweet teeth. I still don't know whether to say our sweet tooth or our sweet teeth, so I'm going to go to our sweet teeth.
I think it should be sweet tooth. You've got a sweet tooth.
You've got a sweet tooth, but what about the plural?
It's our sweet tooths. It's our sweet tooths. Because well, people can write in and argue. But I think it's a sweet tooth that you refer to. You don't say, I've got sweet teeth. I mean, that's meaning, oh, you've got charming teeth. They've been beautifully whitened and straightened. Oh, you've got really sweet teeth. No. A sweet tooth means you like sweet things.
Yes. Shall I tell you a little bit about sugar? Because the history of sugar is quite interesting, really. It probably originated in New Guinea, but if you follow its migration routes, you can trace it to Southeast Asia and to India. And in 320-something BC, one of Alexander the Great's officers talked about seeing a kind of reed that grew near the river Indus, and he reported it as producing honey, but without bees. And that was indeed sugar. And sugar itself goes back to a Sanskrit word sakara. And it sort of means grit in a way because of its gritty crystals. And when sugarcane was introduced into Persia, the Sanskrit term was then borrowed there as shakar. And the Persians, really spread sugarcane cultivation throughout the Arab world. And in Arabic, shakar became shukar, and ultimately that's where it came. But the Crusaders also sampled sugar while they were in the Middle East. And one of them recorded with amazement how people living in Tripoli would suck onto a kind of cane to get its sweet flavor. And this intense sweetness was obviously something really, really new, and it seduced everybody. And that created a demand for a really sweet product, which Venice really became a leading distributor of, and so on and so on. So it's a little bit like salt. You know, the history of salt is so important to the history of civilization, and sugar too, albeit slightly more innocently. Which were your favourite sweets? I need to know.
I loved a gobstopper. When I was a little boy, I loved a gobstopper, and one of my first relationships was with a girl called Susan. I don't know how old we were. 4, 5 at the time, but you could get gobstoppers that changed colour. The gobstopper was so called because it was so big, it stopped your gob. And do you remember they changed colours? They were different. And it was pink, and then there was green inside, and then there was yellow. Do you remember that? You sucked them.
I do. I absolutely love them. Look, my cat has come to join in as well. We're talking about gobstoppers, Bo. Yeah, well, I love them.
Susan and I, we would each have a gobstopper, and we would take it, and then when the colour, we'd keep checking the colour, and then when the colour began to change, we'd swap gobstoppers. Not totally hygienic. And not totally hygienic. So the gobstopper was mine, and the aniseed ball. I loved gobstoppers and aniseed balls. They changed colour too. What were your two favourites?
I liked fruit salads. Which, do you remember fruit salads? They were these sort of little stripy chews that were sold alongside blackjacks, although I think blackjacks actually have a slightly shady past to them. I'm not sure their name was entirely innocent, but I did love those, and they were kind of licorice flavour. So those I loved. I loved wine gums. Do you know why wine gums got their name, or how they got their name?
Please tell me.
Well, apparently Charles Maynard, who invented them in the early 20th century, he wanted to distract drinkers from alcohol. And so he called them wine gums and labelled each one with a drink name as if it would sort of encourage abstinence. Whereas I was scoffing them as a 7-year-old, far more happily than I was drinking port.
Well, we used to have wine gum and candid cigarette parties where we would, we would take the wine gums and put them in little wine glasses, and we'd actually drink drink one at a time from the wine glass, and then while in the other hand we'd hold these cigarettes, and there were two types of cigarettes. There was the ones that were purely made of candy that had a little pink tip. Do you remember that?
The other ones that kind of lit up. Do you remember those?
I do. I don't think they were sweets. I think they just lit up.
I think
they glowed at the bottom.
Joke things, yeah.
I think the ones that you could eat were ones that were made of candy and had a little kind of pink top, and there were other ones that were actually made of chocolate that had white edible paper around them.
Oh, I don't remember those. Okay.
And there were some that actually had sort of like filter tips, a coloured edge to the paper. Oh, it's all coming back to me now.
I know. This is the thing. Honestly, it's like asking someone for their favourite kids' TV programme or their favourite word. Sweets has the same effect.
Did you like any boiled sweets? I liked a lemon sherbet. I think it was a hard
sherbet.
Edge. It was a sort of hard boiled sweet on the outside. And, it did. It was rough on the top of your mouth.
Yes. Bonbons. I love bonbons. You can still get toffee bonbons, raspberry bonbons.
Bonbon is obviously a French word meaning sweet. Bonbon.
Sweet. Nice. Yeah.
But the boiled sweet in England is called hard candy in America, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's boiled, can you believe this? The sugar-based syrup that gives us boiled sweets and hard candy is boiled to 320 degrees Fahrenheit, 160 degrees centigrade to make it. Lollipops also quite often hard candy, aren't they? And I love that because we think it goes back to the use of lolly for tongue, and one of your favourite words is lollygagging, isn't it? As if you're dawdling with your tongue hanging out. And then the pop bit is the slap of your lips as you take the lollipop out.
Oh my gosh.
Which is great.
I liking it. A lollipop. How old is the word lollipop then?
Lollipop, well, I think it was invented in the 1900s as a sweet, but I'm going to look this up because I have a feeling that lollipop itself is probably a little bit older, but let's have a look. 1784, yeah, and it was then water ice on a stick, so it was a little bit like an ice cream.
Yeah, but you still can
originally.
get, of course, ice lollies, which are ice lollipops.
Of course, same thing. And Australian English, lollies are all sweets as far as I know. So I can't wait to get all the emails in from the purple people on this one. What about fruit pastels? I loved those as well. Fruit pastels.
Now, look,
Remember those?
if I give you a tube of wine gums or a tube of
Yes.
fruit pastels, which of those would you go for, the wine gums over the
Green or
pastels?
lemon? Oh, well, of those two, pastels probably.
So would I, because they were softer. And they had a sugary coating on the outside, and then they sort of melted in your mouth. And I'm with you on the green and the yellow. So the green, what would the flavour of the green be? The yellow, I suppose, was lemony.
Green was always lime. But pastel's got an interesting etymology because it's actually linked to bread, panis, bread, because it meant a little loaf, a pastille, and then something that was kind of tiny and sort of almost loaf-shaped, which of course fruit pastels aren't because they're now completely round. But originally these pastilles were slightly lozenge-shaped and sort of a bit longer and then curved at the edges. So that's where pastille comes from. French, obviously, pastels. So part of a really big family that gave us companion and company and a company, all from the idea of bread and people we eat bread with.
As a child, at Christmas, I would often be given, only at Christmas, it was a special thing to look forward to, a candy cane.
Oh, yes.
White and red striped candy cane. And I one year was given one that was so long, I could actually do a bit of dancing with it and swing it around as though I were Fred Astaire. It was too good to eat. Did you have a candy cane?
There's a lovely story. Yeah, I still do have candy canes. There's a lovely story attached to them, which is that it goes back to the 17th century and a choir master at Cologne Cathedral in Germany who wanted his young singers to keep quiet during the ceremony, during the Christmas, I think it was a creche ceremony. And so he would hand out these sugar sticks so that they could suck on those quietly. And in honour of the occasion, apparently he bent them into shepherd's crooks to suit the Christmas story. Isn't that lovely?
That's charming. You mentioned sucking on them. The phrase, suck it and see, do you think that relates to me and the Gobstoppers? You know, you suck it and see what colour it turns out to be. I mean, what is the origin? You've heard of that phrase, haven't you? Suck it and see.
Suck it and see. It's like the proof of the pudding, though, isn't it, really? 1951. And it's mentioned in another great lexicographer's work, Eric Partridge, who was a great slang collector in the 20th century. He says it is a derisive catchphrase that was current in the 1890s. So he places it back to the 19th century. Wow. And then in 1968, we have the New Scientists reporting that biologists prefer to employ the suck it and see approach adopted by Harold Wilson to politics rather than the impractical idealism of Michael Foot.
That's interesting. Well, I loved sucking aniseed balls. I loved the colour that it made. Your tongue then became that sort of dark reddish colour, and your lips too. In fact, I used to put aniseed balls, I used to rub them on my lips to give me lipstick. I remember now, it's all coming back.
You know where aniseed comes from, obviously.
No idea.
It's the seed of the anise plant, which it's got a sweet flavour. It's similar to licorice or fennel, isn't it? And if you like aniseed, I'm guessing you like ouzo, which I really don't.
I used to. When I drank alcohol, I loved ouzo and I loved Pernod, which is the French equivalent. Ouzo, sort of pale whitish colour. Pernod, lovely yellow colour. And I loved the smell of all that. I adored that.
Oh, that's interesting. And what about, and you can still get these, I know, because I have bought myself one not too long ago, a sherbet dip.
Now, I did exactly the same thing and I was disappointed. A sherbet, a habdab, I called it, but it is a sherbet dip.
The habdabs. Yes. That was a lollipop. The sherbet dip was the licorice stick, and the sherbet abdab, or whatever it was called, sherbet dabs, was a lollipop that you dipped in your sherbet.
You're quite right. So the sherbet dip, was it a little sort of piece of paper in which the sherbet, like a triangular-shaped sherbet envelope, where the sherbet was, and then you had a licorice stick, which was hollow, so like a straw, licorice straw, and you would
suck it up.
Suck up.
Sherbet is just too sweet now, but that's another one that comes from Arabic, and it's actually a sibling of sorbet. Sherbet and sorbet, closely related to syrup too, and they were all originally drinks, so very, very sweet drinks. And in fact, they're based on the Arabic sariba, to drink. But that sort of sweet sherbet was originally used to make a fizzy drink in the 1850s. So a long heritage, that one.
What about one of my favourite places in the world is Blackpool. Do you ever go to Blackpool?
I haven't been to Blackpool for a very long time. I need to go again.
You must go again. Christmas lights in Blackpool. If you're in Britain, between, well, it was the 3rd of September and the 3rd of January, the Blackpool illuminations, fantastic. And they're creating a kind of winter wonderland up there at the moment with sort of artificial snow and ice rinks. It's fantastic.
Lovely.
But during the summer, when it's hot and warm, you want to walk through Blackpool with, of course, a wonderful candy floss on a stick.
Candy floss.
Do you like candy floss?
Yes, fun fairs everywhere. I do love candy floss. And it's candy, obviously, but the floss bit is just a reference to that rough silk, which envelops the cocoon of the silkworm. So it's that kind of texture. And it's called cotton candy, isn't it? For the same reason in the US.
It's called cotton candy. Why is there a difference?
Like cotton. Well, I think it's the idea of something flimsy and almost like gossamer, this texture of the candy that we're eating. So it's spun sugar, isn't it, essentially?
Look up the word jujube. J-U-J-U-B.
How do you spell it? Is it like zhuzh?
Well, I don't know what the origin of it is. My father was always talking about jujubes. I imagine, therefore, it's an Edwardian word. My father was born in 1910, at the end of the Edwardian era. But obviously his parents were Edwardians. And he, as a child, loved a jujube. And that's J-U-J-U-B-E.
Yes.
So what is the definition in the dictionary? And when's it come from?
It begins with an edible berry-like drupe, so the fruit of various species of plants. Then in 1835, it's first recorded as a lozenge made of gum arabic, gelatin, etc., flavoured with that fruit, or at least imitating that fruit. And I'm afraid to tell you that the last record we have of it in the OED is 1866, so it's not very current.
This tells our listeners everything they need to know about me and my vocabulary. Maybe then we could do a special edition of Something Rhymes with Purple, where instead of, you can actually listen to Something Rhymes with Purple without the ads if you choose to by joining the Purple Club. But maybe we should have an extra place where you don't need to listen to me because everything I say is so out of date.
I just
That's
was getting
funny.
my own back because you were mocking me for not knowing what on earth a jujube was. But anyway.
Oh, it's so funny. But I promise you, my father talked about jujubes all the time. And we'd go into the shop and he'd say, well, we're looking at... This is why we had such difficulty when we were in Woolworths, because he'd be saying, oh, where are the raspberry jujubes? And they'd look at us completely confused. Well, there you go.
I think you might get something rather different these days. Anyway, licorice all sorts I need to ask you about because I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with licorice. My mum used to have licorice toffees from Callard and Bowser, which were the nicest things on earth. They were sort of wrapped beautifully in this sort of carton with this really delicious foil. And I loved them. But soft licorice, not sure of it. Licorice itself comes from the Greek meaning sweet root, nothing to do with liquor. Sweet root because it's made by evaporating the juice of the root of certain members of the pea family. But there's a lovely story behind the invention, well, at least the inspiration behind licorice all sorts. Have you heard it before?
No.
Well, they're made by Bassett's. They're called Bassett's Licorice All Sorts over here anyway. We should explain because I'm not sure how global they are. They're a sort of mix of sweets that are all flavoured licorice, obviously. And they're like a lot of them are like sandwiches. So you have different layers of what is kind of sweet. How would you describe it? It's a sort of sweet candy layers almost, but soft. And then just little strips of licorice in between. I'm not describing these very well, but they sort of come in all shapes and flavours. Anyway, apparently a salesman or a sales rep from the company Bassett's was visiting a client at a sweet shop and showing the client various samples of the licorice sweets that the company had made, all individual ones. The client was just a bit meh about them until the salesman gathered up his samples to leave and then dropped all of them, and all over the floor was this wonderful, colourful assortment of sweets that the client decided, actually, do you know what? I quite like those. And that was supposed to be the inspiration behind the licorice all sorts. And I adore them.
Well, how interesting, because I don't like them at all. I love the colour. I love the variety of the colour. I love the way we give them different names. I think there's a red one called Betty Bassett. There's Bertie Bassett, who's become a real character. All that is great fun. but the taste for me is disappointing. I love pure licorice. A licorice stick for me is fantastic.
What about jelly babies? Do you like jelly babies?
Oh, I love a jelly baby.
These go back a long time, and they're thought to be the work of an Austrian confectioner who worked for a Friars, I think they were called, of Lancashire. And he wanted to make a mould for jelly bears. At least that's what he was asked to do. But he thought that what he made actually looked more like newborn infants. But the name they gave them, Gyles, was just so ghoulish. Before they became known as jelly babies, they were called unclaimed babies.
Oh, my goodness.
Isn't that awful?
Well, I mean, I thought you were going to say sweet fetus, but I think unclaimed babies is pretty tragic too.
Pretty awful. It was short-lived, for no surprise there. And then Bassett's of Sheffield took over and they called them jelly babies, which is clearly much better.
Does Turkish Delight come from Turkey?
Turkish Delight is from Turkey, and the 19th century apparently saw an unknown British traveller discover a dessert, what was essentially a dessert, and bring it back. And it was traditionally called locum, and he couldn't remember the name. This is the story. I mean, we're not sure how true it is. And he renamed it Turkish Delight. And Charles Dickens in Edwin Drood has a lovely, well, one of his characters has a fantastic alternative name for Turkish Delight, which is Lumps of Delight. And apparently one of the characters, and I don't know Edwin Drood, so I don't know the novel, but apparently one of them says, "To what? The Lumps of Delight shop?" And the answer is, "A Turkish sweetmeat, sir." So, yes, Turkish Delight. I prefer the sort of bastardized chocolate version to the highly perfumed original. I'm so sorry. I'm a real Philistine when it comes to Turkish Delight. You are with
that, because the highly perfumed version,
Turkish Delight,
if there's a little nut inside, it is particularly good.
Okay.
Yes, you like the chocolate-coated version.
Yes, in a
do you
pink
know
wrapper.
who I mean by Noel Coward, the English playwright?
Yes.
Genius. And he went to North Africa for a holiday once, and he reported back to his friends in England that he was, "I'm now in Ankara, where I am known as English Delight." Anyway, that's by the by.
I love that.
Let's turn to some of the phrases. I mean, we talked about sweet tooth, which I think should correctly be sweet tooth. It's clear what that means.
Yes. No, I won't go over it again, but it was just that if you're talking about more than one person's sweet tooth, what do you say? And I'm not sure sweet tooth.
It's a challenge.
Anyway,
I agree.
It's a challenge. That goes back to the 14th century, believe it or not, as in a taste or liking for sweet things. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. There's also the sweet spot. The sweet spot, which is the point on a bat or a club or a racket when it makes the most effective contact with the ball. So it's a sport term originally recorded from the 1970s.
But it's swept into other areas, hasn't it? I mean, when people say, "Oh, you hit the sweet spot."
Yes, exactly. It's now used generally in an idiomatic sense for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is sweet as in nice. A lot of these are to do with sweetness being something that people feel warm
I think
about.
the sweet spot is a very precise spot, isn't it? Where it's that sort of absolute place where the ball hits or whatever. Toot sweet.
Toot sweet means it's actually, obviously, it's actually the French, isn't it? And it's nothing to do with sweets at all. It's sweet as in S-U-I-T-E. Meaning immediately. T-E.
Meaning following,
Toot
yes.
Sweet.
Yes, or following. Exactly. And you asked about sugar daddy, an elderly man who lavishes gifts on a young woman. 1926 is the first reference we have of that.
Yes, that's how we first met, isn't it, Susie?
Speak for yourself. We also have sweet in Sweet F.A.
Oh, yes. Sweet Fanny Adams. Yes,
Sweet
who
Fanny
was?
Adams.
Now, Fanny Adams was a real person. It's something to do with a murder, as I recall.
Oh, horrible. It's very, very grisly. Yes, a poor child who was abducted and murdered. And aboard ships, Sweet Fanny Adams became a horrible, dark euphemism for the kind of tinned rations that people had because her body, I think, was dismembered. It's all really grim. But of course, the Fanny Adams, the F.A. bit, has now been substituted by another F.A. So Sweet F.A. somehow suits the Sweet Fanny Adams thing. But yeah, really dark history, not very nice.
Is that enough sweet talk for today? Should we move on to the correspondence?
I think we should.
And invite people, do tell us your sweet stories. And also ask specific questions if you've got them about the names of sweets, sweetmeats in your part of the world. If you want to get in touch with us, it's purple@somethingelse.com, something without a G. Who have we heard from this week, Susie?
Oh, we have a fantastic question. One of my favourites, actually, to date, from Jenny Bell.
Dear Susie and Gyles, I'm so glad I found your podcast. I studied linguistics at university and love all things language related. My question is to do with the word butterfly. Why are the English, French, Spanish, Italian and German words for butterfly, papillon, mariposa, schmetterling, farfalla, so different? Thank you for all the brilliant discussions so far, and please keep them coming.
Well,
What a polyglot.
And her accent for each one completely differentiated. Gosh.
Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, butterfly, I should say, Jenny. We're not completely sure why it's called butterfly. We don't think it is an inversion of flutterby, which is often the sort of children's etymology. I know. And we have talked about this, haven't we, Gyles? I think there are two theories. One is that, which is not nearly as nice as flutterby, it's that the butterfly's poo is slightly buttery coloured, yellow coloured. And the other is that the sort of old wives' tale that butterflies would fly in through an open window and land on any available butter. And that too is behind Schmetterling, because Schmetten in German means cream and ling is a sort of little diminutive. So that was due to a similar belief that butterflies eat milk products, or that witches transform themselves into butterflies in order to steal cream and butter and things, which is lovely. So I love the way that these are wrapped up in superstition. Papillon is simply straight from the Latin papilio, meaning butterfly. But if you remember, Gyles, that it's a sibling of pavilion, because the tent or awning of a pavilion looks like giant butterflies' wings, which are kind of spread out, which is lovely. Farfalle, that possibly does also look back to the Latin papilio via an old Italian dialect, papaglione. So it may have travelled through various dialects in Italy, through Catalan as well and through French, to end up from papaglione to farfalle.
Is there a pasta called farfalle?
Yeah, farfalle pasta, which is butterfly shaped. Exactly right. Mariposa, the most accepted etymology, says that it comes from the expression Mary alight, mariposa, Mary alight, as in land. And you'll find that in children's songs and games. And it's funny, in Sardinian as well, apparently, there are similar words, Maria vola, Maria fly. So it's a reference to the Virgin Mary. And again, wrapped up in all sorts of superstitions and religious beliefs, which I think is lovely. And finally, I should just say that use of the Virgin Mary, that use of sort of personal names isn't unusual, particularly in Romance languages. So you have, for example, a ladybird in Spanish, the mariquita. You have a Marietta in Catalan. And we have renard in French, which is from a French personal name. And we have the robin. We've talked about this before. So those are the various etymologies that do have some common threads, which are sort of winding through them. But it's such a lovely question. And, as we said, just brilliant accent. So thank you so much for that, Jenny.
Wonderful. I'm sticking with a butterfly being an inversion of flutterby. It's so good. It has to be true, even though it isn't.
Yeah, I understand exactly where you're coming from. We do have also another email, this one from Graham Marshall, which is also really interesting.
And he's in Sydney, isn't he? Melbourne. Oh, no, he was from Sydney, but I think he's in touch with us from Melbourne.
Hi there. I was just remembering about the struggle of up-and-coming musicians, including the time The Clash spent a day gluing posters all over town for an upcoming gig. At the end of the day, they had nothing to eat except for the leftover glue, which I assume was edible because it was made from flour and water. But I wondered if glue might then have a relationship to gluten, the protein in wheat. Graham from Sydney, supporter of the Purple podcast, Fremantle Dockers, purple jersey, Melbourne Storm, purple jersey.
That's clever. Clever stuff.
Clever.
Well, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely. They are related. Both glue and gluten go back to gluten, which was the Latin for glue. You'll find it in agglutinate as well, because gluten is a mixture of two proteins that you find in cereal grains, especially wheat, and they're responsible for the elastic, slightly gluey texture of dough.
Oh.
Simple as that.
Simple as that, but you'd never think it. Completely brilliant. Well, this is why we are so grateful. Thank you very much indeed, Graham Marshall, for getting in touch. And for everybody who from around the world does get in touch, you can get in touch with us. It's purple@somethingelse.com. And you can actually meet us too, because we're doing some live podcasts on stage. And I think our next show is on the 20th of November at London's Fortune Theatre. Wherever you are, come and see us. Each show is different from the last show or the next show, and we just love meeting the Purple people. For tickets and info, go to Something Rhymes with Purple.com, somethingrhymeswithpurple.com, or follow us on social media at Something Rhymes on Twitter and Facebook, or Something Rhymes with on Instagram. That's quite a lot of things to remember, isn't it?
There are. And then now I've got my trio, which is more stuff to remember. I should just say quite often they are not always sort of very trippy off the tongue. So if you're struggling with any of the spellings in my trio, you can always find them in the programme description blurb of each episode. And you'll also find the title and author of Gyles's poem. So 3 quick ones for you today, Gyles. One is, I love these old markers of time like yestreen for yesterday evening and overmorrow for the day after tomorrow. Here's another one, eft soons. Eft soons just means very soon after. Eft
and how do you
soons.
spell eft soons?
EFTSOONS.
And is it one word, eft soons?
Yeah, eft soons, which is just beautiful, I think. My second one, palcrony. Now, you won't recognise this one. Pal, as in my pal, Gyles, and then chrony, CHRONY. Now, this is a neologism, and it's from my friend Tom Reed Wilson, who's written lovely books, especially for children, about etymology. And he created this word to mean being in wonderful synchrony with a friend. Palcrony.
Oh, it's nice.
That's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And the
when you're on the
third
same
one-
wavelength. Palcrony.
Exactly. The third one is probably something that many of us felt, I think, once lockdown ended, because we were so used to our 4 walls and then suddenly we were allowed to go out. I should have mentioned it at the time, really, but I came across it the other day. Eleutherophobia is a fear of freedom, and that's ELEUTHERO phobia. Eleutherophobia, a fear of freedom.
That's interesting. I've been to a beautiful island called Eleuthera. It's in the Bahamas, and it must be called Eleuthera because Eleuthera means freedom. I had no
lovely?
idea when I was
That's
there.
gorgeous.
If it wasn't so far away, I'd fly there this afternoon.
Oh, I'll come with you.
It rivals Blackpool in what it has to offer. It's fantastic.
Perfect. Take some candy canes with you. Right, what about your poem?
It's a short poem, and it had a kind of, I felt it was appropriate, given we've been talking about sweets with interesting and amusing names. This is a very short poem, just 4 lines, written by my friend David Walser. He's a neighbour of mine in southwest London, in Barnes, where I live. He was the lifelong partner of Jan Pinkowski, another marvellous artist who created the Meg, Mog and Owl books with Helen Nichol. Do you remember those lovely books?
Yes.
Anyway, David Walser is an artist, a ceramicist, and a poet. And this is a 4-line nonsense verse that I felt was apt to share with you today. When making a jus in your newly bought blender, a sip is quite hopeless. You must have a snurple. Did you add beetroot? Then the snurple is purple. And a snurple that's purple is fit for a turple. Enjoy.
I feel like Jujube should have been in that poem somewhere.
It could have been, couldn't it? Yes, exactly. I think he meant a jus, Jus, which people now call. They get served lunch and they say it comes with a jus.
Exactly.
It's
like
really,
a foam.
Oh, God, pretentious tosh.
Well, we hope you haven't found us pretentious, Tosh. And if you have loved the show, please keep following us and subscribe, and do recommend us to friends and family. And for more Purple, why not consider the Purple Plus Club? Ad-free listening and bonus episodes on words and language. Something Rhymes with Purple is a Something Else and Sony Music Entertainment production produced by Harriet Wells, with additional production from Chris Skinner, Jen Mystery, Jay Beale, Teddy Riley, and I don't really know what to say about him, really.
When he's a walking jujube. We haven't seen him since 1864. It's Gully.